You ever notice how often we hear about this link between, like, creativity and mental illness, you know?
Hmm.
Like the tortured artist, the mad genius, that whole thing.
It's a pretty common trope, yeah, and one that the Mad Genius Thesis podcast really digs into.
Right. And today, we're diving into one of their episodes. It focuses on Kay Redfield Jamison's biography of Robert Lowell.
Oh, Robert Lowell setting the river on fire.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating one. Lowell, of course, was this acclaimed poet who struggled with, manic depression, what we now call bipolar disorder.
And Jamison, she's not just a biographer. I mean, she's a leading expert on mood disorders herself.
Oh, totally. Like, her book, Touched with Fire, explored those connections, between manic depressive illness and artistic temperament.
So she's coming at Lowell's story from this really unique angle.
Exactly. And the episode asks some pretty thought-provoking questions, like, did Lowell's family history, which had its own share of mental illness, play a role in his struggles? Did those intense moods fuel his creativity, or were they just kind of this tragic parallel?
So many layers to unpack there.
Yeah, and ultimately, what can we even learn from Lowell's life about the relationship between genius, madness, and, that creative spark?
Okay, well, let's dive in. The podcast starts with Lowell's family history, which, I gotta say, is pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah. We're talking Lowell's Andy Winslows here. Huge names in New England history.
The real deal.
And Lowell himself was really drawn to his family tree. He felt like it really shaped him, even thought some of his traits came directly from his ancestors.
Almost like he felt this connection he couldn't quite put his finger on.
Yeah. And Jameson uses his family history almost like a case study. You see these volatile moods, this artistic talent popping up in relatives across generations. It's fascinating.
Wow, so like patterns repeating themselves through the years.
Right. And there's one really striking example. His great-great-grandmother, Harriet Lowell, she was actually institutionalized at McLean Asylum.
That's gotta be tough.
And her records offer this glimpse into how mental illness was viewed back then. Makes you realize how far we've come in understanding and treating mental health.
For sure.
Like Jameson talks about Harriet's symptoms, withdrawing from things she used to love, struggling with what her husband called nonsense thoughts. It's really heartbreaking.
It really adds this whole other dimension to the idea of mental illness in Lowell's family.
Absolutely. And then the episode shifts to Lowell's childhood. He was like obsessed with Napoleon as a kid, almost foreshadowing his later identification with powerful figures during manic episodes. It's interesting,
I see what you mean.
They also describe him as a fire-breathing Catholic CO, definitely a rebellious streak right from the start. And his family dynamics were intense, especially with his mother.
Oh.
Plus, there's this difficult relationship with his father, even a physical altercation. And all of that later found its way into his poetry. Makes you wonder, how much those early experiences impacted him.
Right. Like, were those early signs or just typical kid stuff?
Yeah.
It's that nature versus nurture debate, isn't it?
It's hard to say for sure. But looking at Lowell's childhood gives us some important context, for understanding the whole person. And as the episode goes on, we'll see how these early influences might have interacted with his illness as he got older. And, the podcast doesn't shy away from just how intense Lowell's manic episodes were.
Yeah, like that whole thing with the letter to President Roosevelt.
Right. It's a wild story.
Like the hosts really break down how it all manifested, the delusions, the impulsive actions.
It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And it all led to Lowell's first hospitalization when he was 32.
Wow.
And then, that ended up contributing to his conscientious objector status during World War II.
And the thing is, it wasn't just a one-time thing, right? I mean, the mania kept coming back throughout his life.
Exactly. It's like a recurring theme for him.
The hosts talk about how travel would sometimes trigger it.
Yeah, or even just like really intense work periods or starting a new creative project.
It's interesting. The hosts mention how he would have these episodes where he'd identify with figures like Napoleon, Christ, even Hitler.
It's almost as if that childhood fascination with powerful people, it took on this whole other dimension during his manic state.
I wonder what was going on in his mind during those times.
Right. Like, was it scary or was it exciting? Maybe both. And this is where that whole Mad Genius thesis really comes in.
Right.
Did mania actually unlock his creativity? Like, how did the racing thoughts, the grandiosity that distorted reality, how did it all play out in his writing?
The podcast brings up some specific poems that show the connection. I mean, there's Memories of West Street and Lepke, where he reflects on being in a mental hospital, even mentions that letter to President Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And then there's Waking in the Blue, written during a hospital stay.
Mm-hmm.
Gives you this really raw look at what it's like to be institutionalized.
And they're so powerful, because you can really see how he's taking these really difficult personal experiences and channeling them into art, transforming that chaos into something profound. But of course, Lowell's life wasn't all mania. He also went through all sorts of treatments, trying to find some balance.
Mm-hmm. Right, the episode goes through all of that, the psychotherapy, the different medications, even electroshock therapy.
It really makes you think about how much mental health treatment has changed over the years. And what I thought was particularly interesting was that discussion about when lithium came on the scene in 1967.
Yeah.
It seemed to give Lowell a period of stability that lasted for years. It makes you wonder, do you think that stability came at a creative cost for him?
Oh, that's a really good question. Did that stability, as good as it was for his well-being, did it maybe dampen his artistic fire? I mean, some people might say that his most powerful stuff came from those intense manic episodes.
Right. And that's a real ethical dilemma, isn't it? It makes you think.
It does. It also makes you think about those treatments, especially the electroshock therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a different time, for sure. But you have to wonder if maybe they had some unintended consequences for his creative process.
Yeah, definitely. But Lowell's life wasn't just his illness and his treatment, He had all these relationships, experienced love and loss, and all of that made its way into his art, too.
Absolutely. I mean, those relationships with women were clearly really important to him. Like the podcast talks about his marriages to Jean Stafford, Elizabeth Hardwick, and Caroline Blackwood.
Mm-hmm.
Each one brought its own turmoil and passion to his life and work.
And one that really sticks out, both in the podcast and in Lowell's life, is his marriage to Elizabeth Hardwick. It was complicated, full of love and conflict. And there was that whole controversy when he used parts of Hardwick's letters in his collection, The Dolphin. She never forgave him for that.
Wow, yeah, using someone's private letters like that without their permission definitely raises ethical questions. Like, did he cross a line?
For sure.
And, on a bigger level, how do we even begin to separate the artist from the art, especially with stuff this complex and sensitive?
It's a tricky one, and I'm not sure there's a right answer, but it's definitely worth thinking about as we look at Lowell and his work.
Totally. So we've covered Lowell's family history, his childhood, his struggles with mania and treatment, and those complicated relationships. It's clear that his life was messy, full of contradictions, brilliance, and pain. But what about his legacy? How should we see his impact on literature? And how does all of this connect back to the Mad Genius Thesis?
That's where the episode starts to pull some fascinating conclusions. And that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so wrapping up this look at the Mad Genius Thesis episode, we got to come back to Lowell's legacy, How does it all fit with this idea of creativity and mental illness? The podcast makes a big point that even with all his struggles, Lowell's impact on literature is undeniable.
I mean, yeah, he was a Pulitzer Prize winner, a major force in confessional poetry. People still study and admire his work today.
But how do we square that with the tougher parts of his life, the more controversial stuff? I mean, it's a huge question, right? How do we even judge artists who struggled with mental illness? Do we just separate the art from the person?
It's hard, right?
Was Lowell's genius, tied to his struggles, or did he succeed in spite of them?
It's like trying to pull apart threads in a tapestry, And I really like that the podcast doesn't give you easy answers. It's more about wrestling with the questions, which feels more helpful than just some neat and tidy conclusion.
Totally. And they end with this one quote that really hit me. If Lowell could just erase his mental illness, poof, gone, would his work have been the same? Would we even know his name?
It's hard to picture him without the struggles, without the darkness. Would he have had that same depth, that honesty? It makes you think, maybe those challenges were kind of crucial to his art in a way.
It's a question that gets to the core of this whole Mad Genius Thesis thing. And I don't think there's one answer. But just exploring it, thinking about those connections between creativity and the mind, that's what matters.
Definitely. This deep dive's given me tons to think about. Got to read more Lowell now and see how it speaks to this whole mad genius concept. It's like I'm looking at art, the whole creative process, through a whole new lens,
That's what a good deep dive does, right? Shakes things up, gives you new angles, makes you want to keep digging, keep questioning.
Absolutely. Thanks for diving in with me today.
Anytime. Always a pleasure.